G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we are looking at my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Chinese Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We'll jump straight into the headlines and key considerations for this weekend. The big thing to note in relation to the weekend structure is the tweaking of each session across the entire race weekend. As was the case last season in the sprint race weekends, we would always start with FP1. There was always only one practice session, given the constraints on time with regard to the two sessions for sprints and sprint qualifying in that weekend. In 2023, the sprint weekend would go as follows. On Friday, it would be free practice 1 and the race qualifying. On the Saturday, it would be the sprint shootout and the sprint race. And then on the Sunday, it would be the Grand Prix. The FIA have tweaked the structure to avoid the hullabaloo we encountered last season in Austin, where Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton were disqualified at the conclusion of the Grand Prix due to their ride heights breaching FIA requirements. So they've enabled teams to re-enter Parc Ferme after the sprint race and before the Grand Prix qualifying on the Saturday. So in terms of how that affects our fantasy lineups and the deadline, last season the deadline was at the start of qualifying on the Friday. This time it is at the start of the sprint race on the Saturday. The free practice session will, as is always the case, remain a data point for us to assess our fantasy teams, but we also get the added benefit of the sprint qualifying session as well. So we'll have a yardstick to assess drivers and their performance over a single lap, what that ultimately could mean for our teams over the course of the weekend and how those drivers are expected to perform. Now, there was something else I wanted to touch on and ultimately how that could drive our decision making for this weekend. Parc Ferme aside, the added benefit of the sprint qualifying provides us with, as I pointed out, very useful data points, and I think almost is somewhat of a cheat code. I said before, it gives us an insight into how drivers are performing over a single lap. It also enables us to assess, for those teams not running Max Verstappen as their DRS boost, the best candidate for that slot. Charles Leclerc, Sergio Perez, Carlos Sainz are the three most popular options underneath Max for people running those lineups, and it has been a bit of a coin flip as to which driver is most likely to score the most points that weekend. I think the sprint qualifying will give us an extra data point, an extra session of information that will help us decide on who is expected to be the best driver in that 2x spot, and hopefully gives us an idea of how teams are going to perform with those car setups in the race qualifying on Saturday. Now, I will say that with Parc Ferme reopening prior to qualifying, teams will potentially tweak the setup of their cars if they're seeing performance throughout the sprint sessions that are not reflective of what they're expecting at this track. That may mean results we do see in the sprint qualifying and the sprint race are not representative or do not marry up to the results that we see in the Grand Prix qualifying and in the Grand Prix. So just bear that in mind when making your decisions. I think another useful snippet of information, again tied to sprint qualifying alone, is how that affects budget drivers, that kind of tier C, that $15 million price bracket and below. Particularly when it comes to budget drivers, we want to prioritize those that make overtakes and additional positions gained. The further back you start and the sooner you go out in qualifying, the more of those you have to capitalize on more often than not. So if you do find that drivers in your team are looking quite good in the sprint qualifying, maybe consider transferring them out. If they are, say, a Valtteri Bottas and they're looking at like a P11, a P12, and instead you've got someone like, I don't know, Logan Sargent, or, I mean, he is a bit of a risk to be honest, but maybe a Zhou, whatever it might be, if you're able to toggle between different budget drivers within reason of what cost cap and budget you have available, then do take that into consideration, because if you're able to get those additional positions gained from starting further back, that's obviously going to contribute to additional points for your team and ultimately your rank at the end of the weekend. So that's obviously very important, and I think will be a very useful yardstick for our team heading into this weekend once we're able to ascertain what those data points and performance times look like from the sprint qualifying session. Now, the other important thing, now we're into the thick of sprint races, at least the first stage of sprint races for the season. We've got 2 in back-to-back weeks, then we've got Austria a few weeks later, and then we've got 3 later in the season. So I think there's going to be a lot of chips flying around. Limitless, no negative, even the wild card, I think, are all chips that people have considered if have not already used. And I certainly think there's a case to be made for using a couple of those in China, Miami, maybe even Imola, and into Austria too. Now, I've got some ideas I've seen thrown around on Twitter, on YouTube, from different people in the F1 fantasy community as to how they want to tackle the sprint race weekends. There's a couple of options I've got here, and there's a couple more I might touch on as well. But a very popular one now that budget seems to enable a build of Max Verstappen, Red Bull and Ferrari is where a lot of people are converging towards at the moment. We saw quite a few make that move in Suzuka, and then I expect there's going to be quite a few more making that move for China, Miami, etc. I think for China, Max Verstappen is very attractive. Over 2 race sessions, the sprint race and the Grand Prix, I expect he's going to be P1 in both of them. He's just the best driver in the best car, in my opinion, and that makes him an extremely attractive option for the 2X, where there's more points on the table and more points as the DRS boost to multiply. There is also the option of going with a budget building lineup, where a number of us have run one of Perez, Leclerc or Sainz through the first 4 races, and then had Stroll, Tsunoda, Magnussen, Hülkenberg, Zhou, or a combination of those drivers prop up the rest of our team. Now, if you're going for a Max Verstappen lineup, it's very unlikely you're going to have all of those names I just listed. But I think a lot of people are approaching this weekend, or at least one more weekend, with the idea of hopefully leaning on those mid-price drivers like Stroll, Tsunoda, and the Haas drivers to build a bit more budget. The one thing I will say just to think about is if any of those drivers DNF, and yes, this can happen to any driver on the grid, so don't let me stop you from approaching a certain strategy if you don't want to read into DNFs, because it should never be a primary point of our thinking, unless it's Logan Sargent, of course, is if, for instance, one of the Haas drivers, a Lance Stroll, even a Yuki Tsunoda DNFs, that budget building approach essentially goes out the window, because what comes with the DNF is more often than not, or almost always, a price drop. So, yes, approach that with that in mind. I will say the likelihood of Stroll, Tsunoda, the Haas drivers, who have all looked relatively reliable. I believe Stroll is the only one of those 4 that haven't finished a race, and he was a DNF in Saudi Arabia. Compared to the likes of the Albons, the Zhous, Logan Sargent, the Saubers and the Williams, for instance, just come with a lot more risk. They've got, in the Williams case, the chassis concerns. In Sauber, the wheel nut. The Zhou DNF'd in Japan. So a lot more to be worried about with Sauber and Williams assets, and perhaps there's a higher chance of another DNF from those guys, or any of those guys in China. So in terms of building budget, just going back to that point, you want to be confident that all of those drivers can finish the race. Based on past performance this year, I think that's a very high chance, or certainly higher than the Max Red Bull Ferrari scraps or budget enablers. But yeah, just something to think about, because if there's a DNF, as I said, that could certainly derail your budget building plans. I think running Limitless in Miami is a very attractive option. I'm reluctant to do so in China, only because it's not a track we've raced at. We'll get to that in a minute. But I think you can certainly make the case for using it this weekend. You can use it in Miami. I can't fault you for using it in Austria if you're prepared to wait that long. Any later than Austria, there's probably better chips to use at that late stage in the season. So I would primarily focus your attention to using Limitless in one of the next 3 sprint race weekends. There's also a case for no negative and wildcard, which I want to get into momentarily, but there is, given back-to-back sprint race weekends, and then obviously a lot of people making the move for Max, Red Bull and Ferrari. I think the wild card, the no negative and the Limitless are all going to be flying thick and fast in the next few weeks. So have a plan as to how you want to tackle them. Have an idea from watching content on YouTube, consuming information on Twitter, elsewhere, etc., as to how you want to approach that, because I think there's certainly a lot of options out there and can certainly affect where your team shakes out in the points in the ranks in the next few weeks. So I obviously alluded to all of the different chips and their benefits. I think for no negative, there's a reason I'm considering it if I do ultimately go down the Max Verstappen, Red Bull and Ferrari route, just because of the Sauber and the Williams risks. I'll get to that in a second, but the last time we raced at this circuit in Shanghai was 5 years ago in 2019. 1/5 of the grid, Tsunoda, Zhou, Piastri and Sargent, have never raced at this track before. I think, yes, they're all on their day relatively consistent at least, and we've certainly seen all of them get to the end of the race this season in every race except for Zhou in Suzuka, if I'm not mistaken. But by the same token, there are these drivers that are still quite young, relatively inexperienced, coming to a track that has a lot of change to the tarmac, and certainly the layout of the track itself. So just a consideration there. I think there's also a forecast chance for rain on the Saturday when the sprint race and Grand Prix qualifying is. So that could play a role in a number of different factors in terms of qualifying position, in terms of sprint race outcome. And I think with these extra sessions to score points, as we score points in the sprint race, the Grand Prix qualifying and the Grand Prix, we do not score points in the sprint qualifying. There's more opportunity for a DNF. So I think given the way the no negative chip is now structured, where you get negative points removed per scoring category as opposed to your total race week score as we saw last season, I think that means the no negative becomes a much bigger chip to use and a much more important chip to use on those sprint race sessions, because of the fact there are just more of them and there's more risk to DNF. So I think potentially a no negative in China, where there's a lot of factors in play that may create more risk and a higher chance of DNFs, makes me think I well could be considering it come the deadline this week for Limitless. And I think this will very much apply to Miami as well. The best two teams have been Red Bull and Ferrari so far. I really cannot go past a lineup on Limitless of Verstappen, Perez, Leclerc and Sainz with both of those constructors. The fifth driver is up for debate. I definitely think Norris has demonstrated in a number of races he's there or thereabouts. We've seen Alonso outperform the Aston Martin, and I know Mercedes has been quite mixed throughout the first few races of the season. If anything, Russell's looked much better than Lewis Hamilton, who doesn't seem to really do too well with this car that doesn't suit his driving style. So I think the Mercedes assets are more of a differential. You're not going to see a lot of people in the top 100,000 running any Mercedes coverage at all. So I think if you want to take a punt, then I really like a George Russell there. But you want to be getting the most out of the Limitless chip. I wouldn't be using that fifth slot on a Haas driver. I wouldn't be using it even on Lance Stroll. So try and get drivers that are lower owned, or certainly drivers you think would not be owned in the kind of higher ranks, because it's highly unlikely you're going to see too many top strategists running Mercedes, for instance, or even a Lando Norris as their 2X. So I think if you're running Limitless, and it'll be very much the same case in Miami, I think as well, unless we see a drastic swing in results in China, this is what my team is, or at least this is the team I would suggest, and think about that fifth slot based on sprint qualifying and free practice one on the Friday. As for wildcard, certainly a case to be made, but I think that's very team dependent, and it largely hinges on whether or not you want to tackle that max Red Bull Ferrari lineup, or if you want to go for more of that balanced budget building approach that I was talking about before. And swinging drivers in based on where you expect they'll perform from their sprint qualifying results over the entire weekend. So yeah, that's kind of, I think, a summary of the approach to the weekend. I want to get my team up on the screen here as well. And as I said, I'm in two minds as to how to approach it for China. This is what I had post Suzuka, a very much budget building focused team, all price increase with the exception of Zhou as a result of that DNF, which has really hampered how I want to structure my team, because even with 3 free transfers, as you can see here on the screen, still not enough financial flexibility from that DNF. That Zhou versus Bottas outcome has really hurt not just my rank, but my budget available too. So to get to Max Verstappen, have to go for the 4 cheapest drivers in the game to make any sense of that kind of lineup. I could have Pierre Gasly or Albon, and I'm really frustrated with this Zhou DNF because Hulkenberg is 0.1 more than my remaining cost cap. So I would have just kept him in, not had to take a -10, which I'll ultimately need to do to get in Albon, who I had the week before Suzuka, or Pierre Gasly, which in Alpine has not made a single overtake all season. And I'm really not sure if that's over 2 racing sessions and a qualifying session even enough to think that Gasly's worth a position in my team. So I'm likely going to go for Albon. I say consistency, even though Williams has looked a little off the pace this season, but I think realistically that could be what my lineup looks like in China if I run that team. If I do run this team, for the reasons mentioned around Williams and Sauber, that no negative chip will come into play. I will say the no negative chip does not erase -10s or -20s for transfer penalties. It is only in relation to scoring on track over the weekend. So if you're taking -10 hits, the no negative does not remove that. That will still be assigned at the end of the weekend. I'm probably leaning in this direction as it stands right now, just because of the upside you have with Max over the entire weekend. I'll go across to f1fantasytools.com for their team calculator page. They've got early sims booked in for China, and I've plugged in my value for my team at 106.5 million. The best team that comes out for me is a Gasly in favor of Alex Albon. Projected higher points and higher budget gain between these two lineups. I just don't know. Again, I could swing Gasly's way if I go that direction, but right now I'm in two minds about it. The team I had on screen before is this double Williams, double Sauber, 249 points. It's 3 points difference. It's pretty negligible if you ask me in the grand scheme of fantasy. And then fascinatingly, the third best or highest projected team is pretty identical to the one I had on screen before, my post-Suzuka team. Obviously, Perez in favor of Leclerc, and I still think Red Bull are going to be the strongest car in China. But you've got Stroll, you've got Hulkenberg, you've got Zhou, all drivers that I had in for Japan. So I could get to a lineup like Perez as opposed to Verstappen if I wanted to go that route. Obviously, more budget gain is to be had there, but obviously you've got a lower projected points because I think Max is likely boosting a lot of that team forward. So I think, yes, the projected points for these 4 drivers would be much more conservative than what we've got below them. But at the same time, if you see one DNF in here versus none in here, the price gain is going to increase and the price gain here is going to decrease. But obviously that's both ways. So you can also make the same assumption for the Williams and the Saubers too. But that's essentially where my head's at. I wouldn't say I'm 100% locked on using no negative and bringing in this team for a -10. I do think a -10 would be fine without needing to use wildcard. I think if you're getting to -20, -30 territory, then wildcard for sure. But I think I'm quite content as it stands right now with this lineup. If I do go for it for China, then I'd run Limitless in Miami, and then probably, depending on where my head's at with my team and kind of points across the board, maybe a wild card in Imola. But that's essentially my approach for the next couple of weeks. If you've got a different strategy in mind, drop it down in the comments below, because I've seen a lot of really interesting approaches. I don't think there's any one correct way to tackle the next few weeks. So I would love to get your thoughts on what you think's best in these sprint double headers. But I'll leave it there for now, guys. I'll be back with a deadline stream on FanAmp's YouTube channel. Details are in the description below. On Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern time in the United States, 5 p.m. British summertime. So I'd love to see you there. But if I don't, be sure to drop a like on the video. I appreciate you guys dropping by, and I'll see you all very soon.